He had dreamt of the river for months before he ever saw it. A dark blue ribbon threaded through green fields, running swift and obstinate toward the sea. In the dream, the water spoke in a tongue of foam and eddy, promising a nameless thing if only he would wade into its cold, accept its weight, and let it decide which stones to loose and which to keep. Rhaegar Targaryen had tried to name it for songs, for omens, for his own anxious heart. At dawn beside the trident, with mail under his rubied breastplate and the morning light trapped in the stones like red wine, he stopped naming and listened. The banners along the banks cracked and snapped in a wind that carried the bitter scent of iron. The river ran full, summer-swollen. Midges clouded and dispersed. Reeds hissed. Opposite, Robert Baratheon's men, riverlords and trout and leaping silver fish, stormlords under a stag's crown, arrayed themselves in a tight crescent whose right horn bent toward the ford. The stag himself sat tall and broad on a dapple-brown courser, warhammer resting easy against one thigh. He laughed at something a bannerman said and then fell quiet, rolling his shoulders in the saddle, hungry-eyed. A cheer began among the rebels and moved seaward, a ragged wave across a shore. "Prince," said Arthur Dane softly. Dawn's pale blade leaned against his shoulder, the milk-glass steel catching no hint of gold. "They've drawn the right too thin. They expect us here at the ford." "They expect me," Rhaegar said. The rubies felt heavy and childishly ostentatious. He had chosen this armor to be seen, to turn the battle into a single contest that might spare thousands. Vanity, father would have called it, but Aerys had never understood the power of symbol except the symbol of fire. Let them expect. Old Ser Oswell had the left. Light horse and Dornish spears under the red sun. The high tower held the reserve. The faithful had come when the mad would not listen, and their eyes were on Rhaegar. He raised his sword, and it seemed an instrument more than a blade, a conductor's wand to call blood and order from chaos. He wondered, absurdly, if a harp string had ever been tuned on a battlefield. He had tuned his own until the tips of his fingers toughened and then calloused, until they no longer felt pain at the steel. There were other kinds of steel one could learn to hold without wincing. The horns sounded. Men moved. Dust rose. The river gleamed as if it had swallowed a piece of the sun. The first flight of rebel arrows darkened the air. His shield jerked at the impacts. He rode, and those behind him rode. He saw the stag change course to meet him, saw the hammer lifted, saw 100 lives pivot around the gap that widened between them and then narrowed like the draw of a breath. Rhaegar spurred at the last, standing in his stirrups, voice torn away by wind and thunder. The hammer came down, and he met it with an angle and a turn, a jolt that numbed his forearm and sent sparks off the rim of his shield. They wheeled, the river roaring in his ears. The stag grinned, fierce and pure, a big man's joy in an honest test. He swung again. Rhaegar slid left, let the head bite air, cut, felt leather give beneath the hammerman's gorget and blood slick his blade. Not deep. The third pass, Rhaegar went in before the hammer could climb, slammed his shield boss into breastplate and caught Robert's chin with the edge of his sword. A sharp kiss that striped red across beard and sent the hammer clanging to the earth. The stag reeled, caught the reins, tried to reach the weapon. Rhaegar was already off his horse, water up to the knee in the ford, men closing. Too slow, and he tackled Robert hard enough to throw them both into the river. The shock of cold entered the bones. Hands grabbed at him, at Robert, at both, drowning hands and saving hands. Rhaegar's blade, slick and bright, hovered above Robert's throat. A noise rose like the end of a song. A single clean tone from somewhere inside the prince's skull. He saw a tawny crown of blue roses, the scent of old books, a room littered with scrolls, a woman's hand on a carved harp sounding a tremulous note and then stilling it to listen for what came next. He saw his father's hand shaking, the nails grown yellow and long, a throne like a wound that would not close. He saw Aegon's laugh and Rhaenys' serious eyes. He saw a babe he had not seen, dark hair matted with sweat in a bed made sweet by crushed petals. "Yield," he heard himself saying. "Yield, Robert." The hammerman stared up at him ungentled. "Finish it, Prince. Yield and live. Swear now and live." Swear to what? Robert spat blood into the river. Swear to watch you parade that girl like a second crown? Swear to. Rhaegar pressed the blade to the man's throat until a neat crimson line formed. Swear to the realm. Swear to the justice I will demand. Robert's gray eyes flicked left and right. The battle pressed and bellowed. Someone cried, "For the trident!" And someone else wailed a name that could have been mother or could have been God. A mailed knee drove into Rhaegar's side. He twisted, cut a man across the wrist, kicked him beneath the water. He felt very cold and very awake. "Swear," he said again. "By the seven," Robert said raggedly, and the words seemed to cost him more than blood. "By my house and by the storm that made it. I yield to you, Rhaegar Targaryen, so long as you break your own father before he burns this whole country under him." He had not expected the knife of gratitude that slipped under his ribs at that. He lifted his blade and then his hand, the river making a jewel box of rubies and sunlight. "You have my word," Rhaegar said, and tried to make the words a hearth that a kingdom could step into, wet and shaking, and find warmth. Arthur Dayne waited to them, face pale with the aftershock of intent denied. He offered a hand to Robert, who took it with a bleak glance as if he'd been promised only winter. "Get him a mount," Rhaegar said. "He rides with us." Blood and water smeared into an indistinct veil as the rebels faltered and then broke in 100 pockets. Then rallied again. The trident had chosen which stones to keep, and those stones turned into men were dragged ashore to live. By afternoon the prince held the ford. Men of the trident knelt in mud and foam. Behind the standard of the three-headed dragon, Robert stood wet and furious and under guard, a lion forced into a pen. Rhaegar looked at him and saw the shape of another life in which he turned a wrist a moment slower and a nation cracked along a different fault. He sent riders at once, 2 to the city and 1 south to Dorne. The message was spare as bone. "I ride to the capital. Prepare the gates. Extinguish the pyres." He signed it with his name and seal and then broke the ring he'd worn since the tourney at Harrenhal, an amethyst circlet around an onyx, a quiet thing that had been a gift from Elia, her smile shy and thin from pain even then. He kept the broken ring in his palm for a time and then put it in his pouch beside the harp picks. Ser Barristan Selmy found him alone at the river's edge as dusk bruised the sky. White cloak heavy with water, he bowed. "He lives," Barristan said. "As do too many without sons and husbands tonight," Rhaegar answered. "I thought," Barristan said after a beat, "that you would do what men do on days like this." "I have done what men do," Rhaegar said. "I have thrown lives into a river to see which ones sink. I have made promises with a sword at a man's throat." He turned to the trident, which went on singing as if no blood could ever stain it. "I have spared a man so the realm can learn a new song." Barristan's eyes weighed him and found him wanting or found him changed. Rhaegar could not tell which. "Will he keep your word to keep his?" "He will if I give him something to keep." Rhaegar's hand strayed without volition to his breast where the armor's rubies lay cold and bright. "We ride at first light." He slept in a reed bed with the sound of frogs right up against his skull and dreamt of a tower beneath a sky like hammered silver. In the dream the door wouldn't open, and a woman sobbed on the other side. No words, just the rhythm of grief. He woke with the reeds in his mouth and the taste of river on his tongue. The road to King's Landing was a thin brown slash through exhausted fields. Smoke, somewhere. Not the round, fat smoke of bread ovens, but sharp little licks like burning hair. Twice they passed carts of the dead, wrapped hastily in sailcloth and tied with cord, their feet in mismatched pairs as if death had been in a hurry and unkind about it. At the second, Robert reined in. "That one's a Riverlands boy," he said, pointing with his chin to a blue-painted toenail. "My men like to paint their nails, the idiots, to look like river water." He did not sound amused. "He's too young." "They are all too young," said John Connington, who had ridden up that morning as if called by a string fastened to Rhaegar's wrist. Connington's face still had the weather of exile on it, burned rawer than the faces around him. His hair had been clipped hard, penitential. He had taken a great risk in returning to the prince's side, but Cunnington had always been reckless where Rhaegar was concerned. "You were right to spare the stag," Jon said softly, out of Robert's earshot. "I spared the realm," Rhaegar said, not liking the truth of it in his mouth, which tasted like a lie even if it was not. "Come the gates. We'll see whether the realm spares us." By the time the walls rose out of the country like a bruise, word had run ahead and ran back trembling. Varys waited at the gate of the gods, fingers knitted in front of him like a spider around its prey, powder caking where sweat gnawed at it. "Your Highness," he simpered with a bow low enough to be mockery if mockery could be spoken in silk. "The king, his grace, has questions." "I shall answer them," Rhaegar said, and forced himself not to look for smoke. No common fire crowned any tower. He could believe then that the pyromancers had not yet turned their caches to rain lightning upon the streets. They rode through, the main column trimmed to a size that would not panic the city, alternating red and white cloaks, banners furled. Crowds laid themselves along the cobbles. A woman held up a child to see them better. A man backed away making the sign of the seven as if the prince were an ill wind. When they crossed past the empty bronze rictus of the giant harpy the city had once kept as a curiosity, Robert laughed, and men under his guard shushed him. It was a raw sound but not cruel. In the throne room, the air was a strict cold. The windows had been opened to draw out the stink of fear. Aerys sat like an injury that men had learned to live with, a discoloration they had stopped trying to scrub away. His hair hung lank. His nails were yellow and thick, claw-like, a testimony to years in which he had stopped trimming them and no one had dared suggest they be trimmed. He seemed thinner than memory. His eyes were almost beautiful in their clarity now that madness had burned away the smoke. He had started to look like some old hawk cut from leather. He smiled, slow as wrought. "Son," he said, "your armor is very bright." "It is," Rhaegar said. "I have come to speak of peace." "Have you murdered the usurper?" "He yields," Rhaegar said. "He yields and lives by my word, so that men might go home and take up their plows before winter. He yields so the city need not choke on the smell of burning flesh while children watch." Aerys tilted his head, considering. He put a nail in his mouth and gnawed at it lightly. "You have a tender heart, Rhaegar. You always did. You sang to eggs hoping they'd hatch. If you sing at madmen, do you think we go sane? You were born in the ashes of Summerhall, and still you don't understand fire." An old man in Maester's gray murmured near the dais. Pycelle, fatter than memory and red about the face. Rossart the pyromancer lurked along the wall, eyes feverish. Ser Jaime Lannister stood below the steps of the throne with other white cloaks, handsome as the day he was born, wearing discomfort like a thin garment in summer. Rhaegar stepped forward until his shadow fell across the steps and said, very softly so that the court craned forward, "Father, the caches are to be sealed. I have riders already in the streets counting barrels. The city will not burn to please your fear. The city burns to please my justice," Aerys said, and his voice contained a sudden whiplash of intensity that used to make Rhaegar's heart stumble when he was a boy. "The city burns to wash itself clean of treason. The traitor from the north, his father cooked in his own armor. Do you remember? It smelled like oiled leather, and our Queen's Guard cried while they ate, because the smell made hunger a trickster. They cried and they ate and I laughed. You will burn the Starks and the Arryns and the Tullys and everyone who sang that traitor's name. You will burn the girl and you will pluck out her wolf's teeth." "Enough," Rhaegar said. The word rang as if the room had been made to be a bell. He drew breath slow. "By right of blood and for the safety of the realm, I declare you unfit to rule." Silence struck and stayed. Jaime's hand shifted, not exactly toward his sword, and then back to stillness. Pycelle made a small choking sound like a man swallowing a fishbone. Varys seemed to diminish, his face hollowing, as if there were less of him than there had been a moment ago. Aerys stared at his son with a grandfather's mildness. "You could not kill the stag, Rhaegar. You cannot kill your father." "I have not said I will kill you," Rhaegar said. and recognized the part of him that wanted to weep out of gratitude for that truth. "I say you will not sit that chair again. You cannot take it from me?" Aerys whispered, a swift brightness now, like coins tossed in sunlight. "Your Grace," said Gerald Hightower, voice arid and formal, as if his throat had been made of parchment. "The prince speaks for law. The city is a powder heap. We have seen the preparations. If the rebels had entered first, we would be ash and cries by now." "We are law," Aerys said, white foam at the corner of his mouth. He turned to Jaime as if the others were granite pillars not worth addressing. "You, boy, cut him down." There was a version of the world in which the boy obeyed, another in which he turned his blade upon his king, ending one madness with another. Rhaegar looked at Jaime and saw the weight of being beautiful and quick and so hungry for honor that it ate itself at the tail. Jaime took a breath and spoke not to Aerys but to Rhaegar. "My prince," he said, "command me." The world pivoted not on steel, but on that submission. "Remove the hand and the pyromancer," Rhaegar said. "Take them into custody. Seal every door in the Red Keep. Barristan, Arthur, stand with me. Father, you will be confined until we assemble the lords and the faith to hear the case. Your blood does not protect you from the laws you warped." "I am the law," Aerys hissed, struggling with a suddenly human weakness that made him small as he thrashed. "I am." He would not say those words again in that room. The white cloaks moved with shock and then with a relief so animal that it made tears sudden and hot in Rhaegar's eyes. Men who had choked on their silence a long time. Rossart was dragged, feet scraping, whimpering. Pycelle barked an oath of loyalty a shade too slow and was pushed gently aside for the moment. Varys bowed until he seemed a puddle of silk. Jaime took his king's arm, not cruelly, and the royal sleeve came away in his hand a little where a seam had unraveled. He guided Aerys down the steps as if guiding an old man too proud to ask for a stick. The room breathed. Later, in the small council chamber that still stank faintly of smoke despite the flung windows, Rhaegar sat at the head of the table and stared at the worn grain where generations of rings had drummed and knuckles had tapped. Voices rose and fell around him like a tide. Tywin Lannister's envoy demanded entrance for a host that had overrun the Gold Road and stood before the city like a second sunrise. Lord Varys, fresh as if fear were an exercise done for health, reported the whereabouts of this bannerman and that, the balance of gold in the Casterly mines, the state of the granaries, the rumor of swords in the alleys. Ser Hightower pressed for speed in convening the faith. The High Septon had to bless the deposition or it would be a sword without hilt and would cut the hand that held it. A maester with a tendency to cough spoke about winter signs. Late geese, lean deer. Send Lannister to the Rose Road and keep him there, Rhaegar said at last. He had not yet let himself eat. Food smelled like guilt. He will not enter the city with a host. If he seeks to force the gates, he will find them closed and the streets bristling. Send Jaime to speak to his father. If Tywin will swear the same oath Robert swore, he can camp upon the far bank and feed his men from his own purse. He heard the intake of breath that stood for surprise. To use Jaime as envoy where another might go. Bold and insulting and merciful, a knife and a kiss in the same motion. Varys's powder cracked slightly at the corner of his smile. "And Robert?" Barristan asked. "Escort him to a comfortable cell and then to a guest house," Rhaegar said. "He will sleep in clean linen and be fed meat and bread. In the morning he will write to the lords who raised their banners with him and ask them to come to the city for parley under my protection." He looked at Barristan until the night met his eyes and held them. "No man touches him." Robert's laugh rang out like a challenge when he was told. "No man touches me if I touch first," he said. But he signed the letters, scowling, big hand surprisingly deliberate in its strokes. He slipped one aside into his boot when he thought no one watched. Rhaegar chose to watch and chose not to speak. A man must have a piece of himself to call his own even when he had been broken. Rhaegar understood something about hiding things in plain sight. The Ravenry filled and emptied like lungs in the days that followed. Messages went out with red wax and returned with black. Jon Arryn would come, grim as a winter wall, the letter said. Hoster Tully with him, and Eddard Stark at their head, for he had been marching already, a dark river of men under the Trout and the Direwolf. Mace Tyrell, puffed up with a victory that had never been truly his at the siege of Storm's End, swore loyalty as if there had never been a moment when he'd considered keeping it. Doran Martell answered at once and without flourish. Dorne would stand with its princess and the children she had given the Dragon Prince. No letter could hold the sound of Oberyn's laughter. It came anyway, between the lines, bright as rage. On the third night, Rhaegar took a harp from his chamber's wall and tuned it carefully. The instrument protested the weather so near the sea. He played until the notes were more muscle than thought. Elia came on soft feet, wrapped in a shawl, although the heat still clung to the stone. Her hair fell thinner than it had. She had learned to hide the pain that lived under her skin so well that it only spoke when she moved too quickly or when she forgot she was watched. "You dethroned your father," she said mildly, as if she commented on a turn in a tune. "I did," he said. "It was the right thing," she said. Her eyes were calm sea, an indigo with broken light on it. "Those words have been knives in your mouth for 2 years, and you finally bit. He ordered me to be. Earn them all," Rhaegar whispered, realizing he had not yet said it aloud to her. "All, everyone, like a shepherd who solves a wolf by setting his flock on fire. He was going to break our son's bones out of fear and call it law." "I know," Elia said. She crossed to him and set her thin hand against his cheek. "I am proud of you," she breathed then, a shallow little thing that hid most of itself like a creature under a rock. "Now comes the part where you try to be just. That is a cruel thing to say to me." "No." "Only true." She looked toward the harbor where the masts were a forest and the water took stars in like a miser. "Lyanna Stark." He shut his eyes. He had known the name would come like a prayer or a curse. It had waited in the corner of every room. "I will not insult you by pretending I do not know," Elia went on, voice even. "I knew before the songs. Men think women blind if we do not claw one another in a public square. Dorne makes fewer such mistakes." She smiled then, something mechanical in it that made him want to take the smile out of her face and rest it on a shelf where it would not exhaust her. "I am your wife. The realm needs that more than it needs your prophecy." He had thought he would bleed when she said it, and he did. Some wounds do not show on skin. "I will not set you aside," he said thickly. "I will not dishonor you." "You have already dishonored me," said Elia with no venom at all, and it seemed the kinder that she did not dress truth in nettles. "Do not make me small too. Keep me queen. Keep my children safe. Keep Dorne whole. You may have your wolf in secret, like all men with songs in their heads, have something they feed within the dark to make their daylight decent. But you will not put a crown on the wolf's head and ask me to curtsy." Rhaegar put the harp down very gently. He had never loved Elia so much as then. "She is with child," he said, and whispered it as if the words would crack if he spoke louder. "She is hidden in a tower with my sworn men at the door. She is alone, and I am here trying to unfurl a world that has been rolled so long it has a memory of its own shape." Elia's eyes closed. Her cheek twitched toward a flinch and then away. "Of course," she said. "Of course she is. I did not plan." "Men never do," Elia replied softly, not unkindly. Then, after a heartbeat in which her face trembled and steadied, "Bring her home safe. Bring her child safe. But do not ask me to smile at a second queen. Put the wolf where wolves belong, in the north. Will you hate me? I will live with you," she said. "Hate is for women who will not live. I will live, and I will teach my daughter to live, and I will show my son how to forgive you for being yourself." Something fierce stirred beneath her weariness and put color in her lips. "And if any man in this city or in Dorne looks at me sideways as if I have become small, I will have him put in a cell so narrow he will think he has been buried alive. I am Elia of Dorne. I am not your wound." He bowed his head. She kissed his brow as if he had been a boy who had fallen off his horse and scraped his knees. "Send a fast rider," she murmured. "Send two. I think she is nearer to her birthing than you hope to admit." He did. At dawn he swore in the High Septon to assemble a council of lords and most devout to weigh Aerys's madness and make formal what had been done. He sent Jaime out with words and a white cloak instead of a sword. The Lannisters made camp like a golden city beyond the kings, raising tents whose guy ropes glowed in the sun as if woven with coin. Jaime came back with his jaw set and eyes wary and did not say what had been said, but Rhaegar thought he could guess. Tywin would not forget the slight his daughter had taken when she had been denied the prince. He would not love being kept outside the gates like a peddler, but he wanted his lion's paw in any future worth having. He would play at patience. Before the council could meet, the north came like weather. Jon Arryn entered first beneath the seven-pointed star, spare as winter grass, his mouth a calm line. Hoster Tully came at his shoulder, face florid and stiff with a lord's pride that had recently learned humility. Eddard Stark came behind, and when he raised his eyes to the prince, Rhaegar felt a weight so grave, so plain, that it could only have been carved by grief. Men speak with what they have. The young lord of Winterfell spoke with what had been taken from him and with what had not. They met in the solar with the harp in the corner and maps spread. No torches burned. The daylight was honest enough for such a conversation. Rhaegar dismissed everyone but Barristan. Eddard went to his knees with a grace born of discipline rather than habit. He bowed his head. "You have done a monstrous thing and a merciful one, Prince." "I have done many," Rhaegar said, then shook his head. "Rise, Lord Stark." Ned did, slow. His eyes did not lower. "My sister." Rhaegar had decided the words long before he spoke them, but they still tasted like stones. "She is alive," he said. "She is with my sworn. I will take you to her." Silence chimed. Jon Arryn drew breath, let it out. Hoster Tully touched the tip of a finger to a spot on the map where the river made a loop and then lifted the finger without looking at the vellum at all. "Alive," Ned said, the word a string breaking. "Did she go with you freely?" "I," Rhaegar said, and all the sentences he had built collapsed into kindling. "I loved her. I love her. I cannot excuse what I took. I can tell you this, I did not hurt her. No hand touched her in anger while she stood in my protection." "Your father killed my father," Ned said. "Your father strangled my brother. My sister loved us and you took her away while we buried them. That will sit between us like a third thing, no matter what else we say." His jaw worked, a faint movement as if he had a bit of gristle in his mouth. "I will see her, then I will speak of oaths. You will have justice for Ricard and Brandon," Rhaegar said. "I cannot give you back years with them, but I can give you a day in which this city sees a king must be a man, judged as men are. After that, I will give you a road north and my own escort at your back." "I'll take the road," Ned said. "Not your escort. I'd rather travel with the wind." It was not insolence. It was a refusal to be indebted to grace that had already cost too much. Rhaegar accepted the blow and nodded. "3 riders," he said to Barristan. "We leave at dusk. Ser Arthur will be at the tower already." He looked back to Ned. "I would see Lyanna myself. The rest can wait." The dusk ride to the mountains of Dorne had the feel of a secret, even though the truth of it had too many witnesses to be a proper secret at all. They left by the river gate and followed the road until their shadows became taller than men and then tattered with the wind. Barristan rode in silence, hands light on reins. Eddard rode as if joined to his horse by sorrow. He asked few questions. He did not talk of Robert. Rhaegar thought he could hear the words unsaid in the clink of bit and the rhythm of hooves. "Why did you? How could she? What are we now?" They changed horses at an inn that had not yet learned to stop being afraid. The innkeep's daughter watched them over a pitcher of watered wine. Her hair a sleek black fall down her back. She was of an age with Lyanna. When they left, she pressed 3 wild rose petals into the prince's palm, without speaking, as if she had been told to do so by something that did not speak itself. Arthur Dayne waited beside a pale tower set like a finger pointing at the sky. The land fell away around it in shelves of gray stone and scrub. 3 white cloaks with him. Oswell went, Gerald Hightower, and a young knight whose name Rhaegar forgot to know he would forget. Dawn rested in its scabbard like a prayer on the hip of a man who did not pray much but did not need to. "You should have sent for me sooner," Arthur said without preamble. His face had that Dane gentleness that made men mistake him for something other than the most dangerous man in 10 leagues. "I was unready," Rhaegar said. "I am ready now." Eddard had not dismounted. "My sister," he said, and his voice trembled for the first time since they had met in the city. Arthur nodded. "Alive," he said, "and nearly done with her labor." He bowed to Rhaegar, but it was the bow of a friend to a friend across a disagreement still unsolved. "She has fever. There was a storm 2 nights ago and the roof leaked." The prince swung down. The tower swallowed him with the smell of lime and clean straw. The stair turned up like a path made by a snake. In a chamber with narrow slits for windows, Lyanna Stark lay in a bed of woven rushes with sunlight laying pale bars on her skin. A midwife bent over her with the concentration of someone unlearning fear. The girl's hair was spread on the pillow like a field of winter-dark grass. Sweat painted her lip. She had grown thinner, and the bones of her hand showed delicate as birds. She looked at him and stopped breathing for a heartbeat, and then began again with a fierce willfulness that threw a shadow of laughter over her eyes. "You always come at the end of songs," she whispered. "I wanted to be there for the whole of it," he said, and took her hand. It was very hot and very light. "I was singing to the river." "The river doesn't listen to men," Lyanna said. She made a face as a pain rolled through her, and gripped his hand in her small, iron fingers. "You can't charm it. You can only learn where not to step." Eddard came into the room as if pushed by a wind. He stood at the foot of the bed and folded his hands to control them. "Lya," he said. He did not call her sister. He called her by her child's name and put his entire childhood in it. She looked past Rhaegar and smiled in a way that was all wolf. "Ned, you're skinnier. I hate it when you get skinnier." He came a step, then stopped. Rhaegar let go of her hand and stepped back because there is a part of love that knows when it is not the center of a room. Lyanna's breath shortened. The midwife said, "Hush," not unkindly, as to a mare who had already learned what had to be done. Outside, wind braided voices around the tower. Arthur and Barristan speaking low, Oswell's chuckle, a clink of metal. The air smelled of old stone and the faint sweetness of dried reed. When the child came, he came with a little cry like a question. He was dark-haired and long-fingered and furious at the change the world had visited upon him. The midwife tied the cord and lifted him, briskly efficient. Lyanna made a sound that coincided with the wind, and Rhaegar took the child, and the child turned toward his warmth as if love had a physics. Lyanna watched them both with a hunger that was not for bread. "Promise me," she said, not with hysteria, not with fevered rhythm, but with a starkness that turned the room into a place where only truth could stand. "Promise me you'll do this right." "I don't know what right is," Rhaegar said, and the admission felt cleaner than any he had made. "I know the shapes that will keep him alive." "Then pick the one that lets him be a boy," Lyanna said. "Not a banner." She shut her eyes, opened them again. The fever lapped at her lips. "Not a line in a song you won't ever finish." Eddard stood rigid as a spear. "I'll keep him," he said, "if that's what's asked. I'll keep him and teach him the names of the trees in the Wolfswood. He can be some miller's bastard. It doesn't even matter. But you don't get to make him a torch." The child rooted blindly at Rhaegar's knuckle, finding nothing. The prince lifted him to the midwife and drew his hands empty, and felt at that moment as if they were meant to be empty for a long time. "I will keep you Queen Elia of Dorne," he said to a woman not present and also to the one dying before him. "I will keep you safe, Lyanna Stark." "Bad promises," Lyanna murmured, but the ghost of a smile flickered. She turned her head toward her brother. "Ned, promise me." "I promise," Eddard said, and the oath joined the air and sat in a chair with the other oaths that had arrived before it and the ones that would arrive after. The room seemed crowded with chairs. She slept then, and when she woke the fever had climbed to a place from which it would not come down. She spoke little and with difficulty. Rhaegar sang to her once. Not a tourney ballad, not the silvered lyrics of poets, but a simple river song he remembered from a summer in the countryside when he had been 12 and the world had still been thin enough for light to pass through it. She smiled without moving and afterward turned her face to the wall. She died with her brother's name on her mouth. The wolf lay still in the bed and the room seemed to turn to stone around her, as if it had been a living creature until that moment and now decided to become itself. Eddard closed her eyes gently and set his hand on the crown of her head like a blessing. He did not weep loudly. If tears came at all, they went into his beard in a quiet trickle and dried. Rhaegar stood and held the child for a time that had no minutes in it. The babe smacked his lips and sighed profoundly as if he had gathered this first lesson, that the world gives and takes as if it had a private rhythm no man can learn. "He will need a name," Rhaegar said at last. "He already took one," the midwife said. "He's greedy like that." Her voice had the bleached calm of someone who had learned to bury without becoming a ditch. "If you ask me, the wolf would like him to have a simple name. A northern name that doesn't glow in the dark and signify 6 old songs." "Then a simple name," Rhaegar said. He looked to Ned. "You choose." The young lord of Winterfell considered his sister's face as if her features could answer, and then shook his head almost imperceptibly. "I will call him what's safe," he said. "What the wind will not carry. Leave it to me, Prince." "Good," Rhaegar said, and felt something tear neatly within, like cloth cut for a garment. "I will have men bring a litter. We will take her back to Winterfell. We will lay her in stone beside her father." He looked at Arthur in the doorway, whose tight jaw betrayed more grief than tears on another man. "Sir Arthur, you will ride with Lord Stark to the Neck, and from there his men will see him home. You have my authority to use whatever you need." "You are my authority," Arthur said, quietly and without question, and Rhaegar loved him for how easy he made that sound. On the return, they rode in a silence no one attempted to mend. The babe slept, woke, yowled, slept. In the city, the bells were not ringing. Rhaegar had told them not to. He convened the lords and the most devout in the great September, where banners hung heavy and incense made the air sweet as if it had a memory of gardens. The High Septon was a careful man, his hands soft and well cared for. He listened to the testimonies of the Kingsguard, to the Maester's catalogue of behaviors that had grown from oddity to cruelty to mania. He listened to Barristan Selmy say quietly, standing straight as a lance, that the oath to a king presupposed a realm worth swearing to. He listened to Varys produce the tally of wildfire barrels and their distribution. He listened to Rhaegar speak of the day Rickard Stark died and the laughter in the hall. When he spoke at last, it was in a voice like an old river smoothing stones. "There must be a king or there will be 1,000 little kings," he said. "There must also be a man. Sometimes one lives in the other. Sometimes the one eats the other. The faith declares Aerys Targaryen unfit to rule and removes the balm of sanctity from his crown. The faith anoints Rhaegar Targaryen, lawful heir, in his stead. They crowned him with oil and song. They named Elia queen and her children the succession. They set aside the young Viserys in his remote sullenness and made him a prince under the law that would keep him safe so long as he learned new dignity." Robert Baratheon watched with an expression that could have been contempt if not for the fact that he seemed too tired for contempt. Eddard Stark stood in the back pew beneath a carved 7-pointed star and left before the last hymn was done. Tywin Lannister arrived at the end with a face that did not move and a bow that was not empty of respect but had too much arithmetical calculation in it to be mistaken for love. "Lord Tywin," King Rhaegar said later in the cool geometry of the council chamber, "you have come armed and late." "The west is far," Tywin said. "News comes slow to Casterly Rock and slower if a man has to judge whether it is true." "My son will marry your daughter," Rhaegar said, "because sometimes one must put a blade on the table with the point toward oneself to show that one carries it without fear." The room stilled. "When he is of age, she will be Princess of Dragonstone." Pycelle made a small noise of fat gratification. Varys lowered his eyes. Tywin's mouth tightened infinitesimally and then relaxed. He was too cautious to smile. "My house is honored," he said. "Cersei Lannister would have a boy to dream upon now. She would be within the corridor where queens walked, even if she had to share it with Dorne. Tywin would have his gold tied to blood. He would accept the insult of gates closed as an opening of another gate. As for Robert Baratheon, Rhaegar said, turning not to Tywin but to the room, he is pardoned. He will be restored to Storm's End and named Warden of the Stormlands. His brother Stannis will be confirmed as Lord of Dragonstone, as is custom, in honor of his valiant defense. That last tasted a bit of sugar. The Reach had tried to starve Stannis, and Stannis had not yielded. Rhaegar admired the kind of stubbornness that could save men in winter. Robert's head went up at that. "A wedding gift?" he asked roughly. "A recognition," Rhaegar said, "of what a man held when he held a castle and the men inside it did not eat each other." He met Robert's eyes and added in a voice only the other could hear, "And because I owe something to the boy you were before the songs ate you, I cannot give you what you lost. I can give you room to be something besides an enemy." Robert's jaw worked. After a long, brittle moment, he said, "I'll take the room, Prince. I'll fill it how I please." "Fill it with a wife," Tywin murmured, smooth as cream. "House Lannister proposes an alliance. The Lady Cersei is meddlesome and fair." Robert stared at him bleakly and then laughed, short and ugly. "So you get both stag and dragon on your mantle," he said. "No, my lord. I'll find a wife who doesn't look at me like I'm a mule she'll sell when it starts to limp." He did not look at Rhaegar as he said it. "I'm done with songs." Mace Tyrell coughed up a list of pretty girls as if they were jewels from a coffer. The council moved on, slow like the rolling of a great wheel that had to be pushed by many hands. It named new sheriffs in the Riverlands, removed old ones who had failed to know law from appetite. It sent men into alleys to find casks and break them open and pour out green fire into sand pits where it fumed and muttered and then went to sleep. It counted coin and measured grain. It wrote to the north with condolences in ink that never dried. Eddard Stark left the city with the dawn and a litter bearing a girl under white. The Seven gave him safe passage through river fogs and along the causeways of the Neck. Arthur Dayne rode with him until the mists began to smell of peat and the cries of marsh birds changed. At the last ford before the barrows, the two men drew rein and part. "D-Hands, tell your king," Ned said, "that he has bought peace with a coin dearer than he knows. I'll keep his change safe." Arthur bowed. His heart had always been too open for court. "Tell your Winter," he said, "that my sword will be where law is struck at." His eyes softened. "Tell your sister that nights do not cry. Or tell her that we do, and then lie to me about having told her, so I can live with myself." Ned smiled one quick wolf smile, and they parted. The year turned. Aerys paced a room so bare the guards called it the bone chamber and muttered to himself until the words became ash in his own mouth. Rhaella, freed of her fierce husband, walked in the gardens with a thin smile and a hope like a fragile bird in her bosom. Hope for grandchildren. Hope that her son would not become his father. Viserys sulked and posed. Rhaegar set tutors to him who would not be either awed or afraid. Elia sat in council when she had the strength, and on other days took her children to the Sept and to the water's edge and taught them that a palace is only a bigger room with more doors. A heart had to choose which doors not to enter. Cersei Lannister was sent back to Casterly Rock with a cool chest of gifts and a promise that would not warm her bed. She looked at Rhaegar with a scorn she did not bother to hide. She had expected a prince to be prettier and less complicated. Tywin hid his annoyance in talk of tariffs. Varys watched and counted, the way a spider counts the legs of flies even when they fall off. At Dragonstone, Stannis Baratheon walked the halls and smelled the sea and the old eggs in the furnaces and thought about law until law seemed a kind of ship you could caulk and mend. He administered with a relentlessness that made the fishermen hate him and trust him like tide. His younger brother Renly grew into beauty and into a gaiety that made men lean toward him. He was too little to be truly dangerous then. Robert hunted and drank and did not weep, which is not the same as not grieving. He married a girl from the Stormlands of good temper and good hips, and fathered a son who looked at him with too bright adoration that made Robert drink more and then less for a while and then more again. The North wrapped its dead in stone and snow. Eddard Stark married Catelyn Tully in a ceremony stripped of flamboyance, as if grief sat at the foot of the bed watching, and they would not tempt it to climb in with them. Their first child, a girl with hair like autumn light, was born with a frown that made her father laugh for the first time since the Tower. Another came with a sly grin that seemed borrowed from a fox. Catelyn learned to share her husband with a boy who was not her husband's in the eyes of the world. She had been bred to duty and faith, and she gave both, but it cost her. A resentment so tidy she folded it and put it away in a drawer where she thought no one could see it. Eddard saw and went on loving her without asking her to be something else. He sent the boy to the forge and to the kennels and to Maester Luwin and to the Godswood, and loved him brightest among his children in the way a man loves the proof both that he has sinned and that he can do something right afterward. Rhaegar made a seat of law from the throne's unease. He named Jon Arryn Hand of the King, and the cool Lord of the Vale governed as if he were building a stone bridge across a fast river, carefully knowing where to put weight. He gave Mace Tyrell titles enough to keep the Reach preening and stop it from sulking, and gave Doran Martell quiet respect and a share of the truth that Elia demanded he share. He refused Pycelle the license to whisper the Citadel's prejudices into law and sent for a younger, leaner man whose chain clinked with fewer fat links. He invited the Night's Watch to send men to court to speak for their needs. When they came, he listened gravely and afterward ordered obsidian to be mined from the island and shipped north in lots large enough that the masons swore at the weight of it. He could not have said why it made him rest easier to think of black glass knives stacked like firewood in a cold castle, only that it did. "Do you trust old stories that much?" Elia asked with a tired smile, watching him sign the orders. "I trust winter," he said. "I trust that we make songs because winter frightens us and insults are illusions of advancement. I trust that if the songs talk of walking cold and blue-eyed things enough, then someday some blue-eyed thing will come out of the dark to justify the songs. I would rather be a fool who believed too much than a corpse who believed too little." She shook her head with the fondness reserved for difficult men. "Just keep the granaries full when the snows come," she said. "The realm will praise you more for bread than for black glass." He played the harp at night when the palace was softer. Sometimes the girl with a fox's grin from the north ran under the table during audiences and hid there to see if anyone would step on her. Sometimes Robert wrote letters full of insults like badly carved arrows and signed them with a flourish that made Rhaegar laugh despite himself. Sometimes Viserys went to the windows and stared east and talked about dragons as if he could call them out of air by will, and Rhaegar would go and put his hand on the boy's shoulder and say, "The dragons are asleep in the stones yet. Let them sleep. The realm has had enough waking monsters." He permitted himself one visit north, in a winter when the sea froze in little scallops along the shore and the trees crackled with ice that tinkled in a wind like bells. He did not go to Winterfell. He had earned the courtesy of refusing to make new wounds bleed. He rode instead to the long barrow roads and stepped into a godswood where the heart tree's face had been carved when men still had different words for grief. He laid a white rose at the foot of the tree and held his breath until it hurt to let it go. He saw a boy with dark hair and his son's hands racing a girl with mud-splashed stockings along a frozen brook. They shouted with such lack of dignity that it seemed a kind of holiness. He let himself smile and then he left before anyone could say his name. In King's Landing, Aerys died one night as simply as if he had decided that breath was a thing other people used. He lay down and did not wake. The guards called for a maester. The maester came and put fingers to throat and listened for the treachery of hope beneath the old man's skin, and found none. The body stank quickly because madness leaves rot in its wake even when it has been kept in a clean room. Rhaegar went and looked at his father and allowed his face to be blank. He dismissed everyone and sat alone with the corpse, hands clasped between his knees, and at last said, "I hated you," and then wearily, "I tried not to," and then quieter still, "I failed." He touched the dead man's hair and felt nothing. Afterward, he let the pyromancers light the corpse pyre because love of irony sometimes prevents men from going mad. The green fire rose, and the city watched fearfully and then in relief as it stayed in its bowl. Years laid themselves down like pages. Aegon grew from a boy who knocked lead soldiers over with a stick and insisted upon explaining strategy while at it, into a young man with a Targaryen's coolness and Elaya's marshaled warmth. He met his betrothed Cersei Lannister when both were old enough to find fault in everything and each looked at the other as if assessing a horse. Teeth, legs, temperament, gait. Cersei had learned to smile in a way that did not bend any of her tension. She would be a queen, and if not in the way she had practiced as a girl, then in a way that men would still have to look at. Rhaenys read everything and took apart clocks and put them together with a piece left over. She fell in love 6 times by the time she was 14 and out of love 6 times and laughed each time without cruelty. From the Iron Islands, Balon Greyjoy climbed into his pride like a man tugging on a coat too big and pretended it fit. He raised krakens and sent ships to fight with wind and spray. Rhaegar's fleets, better built and more purposefully led for once, broke them like kindling off the fingers. Stannis set hooks into the law of the islands and dragged it into the light. The Ironborn spat salt and brine but coughed up a half-loyalty because even salt men like certainty if you give them none. The 7 kingdoms remained 7, but the seams between them were stitched with a quiet thread. Rhaegar thought often of the tower and the girl who had demanded promises rather than poetry. He thought often of the boy gone north with a name safe as a stone under snow. He did not send spies to watch the boy beyond what he would have sent to watch any lord's ward. He did not need to watch. The boy would be taught by a man who was his own law. He settled his hands on the work of being king and learned where not to step. When news came of Eddard Stark's second son being nearly killed by a fall from a tower in Winterfell years later, Rhaegar set the letter down and went to the window and looked east, not because help would come from there, but because the sea let a man imagine he could walk until nothing hurt. He thought, briefly and against his will, of boys and of roofs that leak in storms and midwives' hands. He shut his eyes, whispered a piece of the river song he had sung long ago, and returned to the table where the papers lay. Sometimes, in the night, when Elia slept and the city lay quiet except for the lap of water against the quays, the king would rise and go to the room where he kept a harp and the broken ring and a single blue rose pressed in a book. He would play very softly until the notes braided themselves around the thought that had followed him since the trident, that a man who waded into a river to spare a life had to keep waiting for the rest of his days. The river kept him honest. It taught him that mercy was not a moment but a practice, that a child needed bread and winter boots more than prophetic names, that a queen could be wounded and still be a queen, that a father might be a wound a son learned to bind without becoming a copy of it, that love was not an argument one could win in public and might be better kept in the privacy of a godswood. When he aged, silver threaded his hair and did not diminish him. The court learned to read his silences and to fear them more than his words. He made mistakes, fewer than some, more than he could forgive himself. He tried to make songs out of policy and policies out of songs. He dreamed less and slept more. He never again wore rubies into battle. Once, on a spring day that smelled like wet earth and new grass, he walked in the gardens with his granddaughter, a child with eyes the color of river water. She put her hand in his and said, gravely, "Grandfather, do kings always have to be sad?" "No," he said, surprised into honesty he had not meant. "Sometimes kings are useful. Sometimes they are in the way. Sometimes they are just men who got their feet wet a long time ago and forgot how to be dry." She considered this and then said, "I like you," and then, satisfied with philosophy, ran toward the fountain and fell into it with a splash that made everyone shout and then laugh. At dusk that day he found Robert in the solar, a rare visit in which the stag carried no wine and no anger. They sat together a long while without speaking. Finally Robert said, "I have a son who doesn't understand that his fists will not solve his heart. I don't know how to teach him because I never learned it myself." Rhaegar thought of a boy that had been taken to the wall once with too much law and not enough warmth in him, and another with laughter that made the dust jump on roads. "I have learned to be a king," he said. "I have not learned to be a father very well. Perhaps that is our fault. We learned to do big things and forgot to do small ones." "I still hate you sometimes," Robert said without heat. "Not the man, the song." "I hate the song too," Rhaegar said. Both men looked at the fire then, and found a measure of peace in its restraint. When winter finally came in earnest, it came not with blue-eyed monsters walking but with plain miseries. Snow that bent trees into bows, rivers that lost their voices under ice, men who grew thin and pale and mean. The granaries did their work. The knives of black glass sat in their crates like an old precaution a cautious man had once ordered. Rhaegar visited the sept and the docks and the kitchens and the rooms where men with coughs lay in rows. He played at night, and sometimes in the song he thought he heard a woman laughing. Not cruelly, not forgiving, just laughing in an old stone tower because a child had found his own thumb and was treating it like a miracle. When he died at last, it was after a morning of simple business and an afternoon of quiet. He had eaten with Elia and kissed her hand as if it had been the first time, and then taken his harp into the little room where he kept the broken ring and the pressed rose. He played a river song and a winter song and a song for a city that had not burned. He fell forward not ungracefully, and the harp tumbled and struck the floor in a single melancholy chord. The servants found him with his cheek on the wood and his hand outstretched as if he had meant to catch the note as it fell. They buried him under stone where kings lie and where songs cannot be heard. Robert came, heavy and quiet, and stood a long time with his hand on the stone. Eddard sent a single white rose. Elia stood with her children on either side. She did not cry, because she had learned another practice. To let grief be a country you walk through, not a sea you drown in. The realm went on. The river went on. Somewhere far to the north, a man with dark hair, grown now and measuring his own shadow against the new snow, taught boys to shoot straight and to leave bread on a stump for a thin fox that came in silence at dusk. Because mercy is a thing a man can practice even when no one writes songs about it. And the trident, in the brief green of spring, sang its complicated, untiring song, louder than any harp and never quite the same twice. He kept his secrets and carried his promises and forgot his name exactly the way rivers are meant to forget, because that is what allows them to run.